One night of October, in the glass-walled ballroom of the Bellwether Hotel in New York City, I stood in a crimson silk gown my husband had never seen before and watched him thank a room full of bankers for a merger that would not survive the night. If you have ever been underestimated by the person who claimed to know you best, stay with me, because that was the minute I decided to let Charles finish his speech before I took back my name. The room was beautiful in the expensive, impersonal way powerful people seem to prefer. Light from two tiered chandeliers poured over mirrored columns and polished floors. Waiters in white jackets moved like choreography between black tuxedos, diamonds, and practiced smiles. Every table held white orchids so perfect they looked artificial. The city glowed behind the glass walls, all those lit windows and steady traffic making the ballroom feel like a private planet suspended above ordinary life. My husband, Charles Davenport, belonged in that room the way certain men belong in tailored suits and boardrooms and the front pages of business magazines. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and so accustomed to being listened to that he had stopped noticing when other people stopped speaking around him. To the world, he was the chairman and chief executive of Davenport Hospitality Group, a hotel empire built on old East Coast money and aggressive modern ambition. To donors, he was cultured. To investors, he was disciplined. To younger men in finance, he was the example they quoted over lunch. To women like me, if they were paying attention, he was a cautionary tale in a perfect tie. He stood on the stage with one hand resting lightly on the podium, speaking in that low, controlled voice of his that made even boring numbers sound like prophecy. Beside the stage, his chief operating officer, Vanessa Lee, watched him with the proprietary half-smile she always wore when she knew other women were looking. Vanessa had dark hair cut blunt at the shoulders, white teeth, and the kind of confidence that can only survive if it is fed regularly by somebody else's power. She had joined the company 2 years earlier. 6 months after that, she had started appearing at dinners she had no reason to attend, laughing too softly at Charles's jokes, leaning too close when they reviewed event details, wearing his preferences like perfume. I noticed everything. That was my first mistake, and, eventually, my advantage. At 8:44, Charles said the phrase, "a new chapter of disciplined growth," and the room gave him exactly the response he expected. A murmur of approval, heads nodding, champagne glasses raised. I stood near the front, beside a woman from a private equity firm who smelled faintly of sandalwood and old certainty. She whispered, "Your husband really does know how to command a room." I turned my glass slowly in my hand and said, "He commands it best when he thinks no one else has read the paperwork." She laughed, assuming I was being charming. I let her. The truth was that by then, I knew more about the paperwork than Charles did. But none of that makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning was not the gala. It never is. The beginning is always smaller than people expect. A remark over dinner, a look held 1 second too long, a silence that becomes a structure. My name is Margot Sinclair. I am 49 years old, and for 9 years, I was married to one of the most admired men in American hospitality. In photographs from those years, I look exactly as he preferred. Composed, elegant, slightly distant, dressed beautifully, but never loudly, always just enough behind him to confirm his importance without competing for it. Strangers often told me I looked serene. That amused me in private because serenity had very little to do with it. What they were really seeing was discipline. Before I married Charles, I was a forensic accountant. Not the glamorous kind from television, if such a thing even exists. I worked mostly with private firms, family offices, and occasionally prosecutors, tracing where money had been hidden, renamed, overvalued, quietly bled out, or dressed up to look cleaner than it was. Numbers made sense to me in a way people often didn't. They had habits, they left marks. They could be forced eventually to tell the truth. I met Charles in May of 2016 at a charity dinner at the Frick Collection. I was there because my then firm had done compliance work for one of the sponsors. He was there because men like Charles are always where legacy and visibility can be photographed together. I remember him approaching me near a floral arrangement that probably cost more than my monthly rent at the time. He asked what I did, and when I told him, his eyes sharpened in a way that felt flattering then. A woman who can read ledgers and Renaissance portraiture, he said. That's dangerously specific. It was a good line. He knew it. I knew it. Still, I laughed. He pursued me carefully at first. Flowers, museum openings, dinners at restaurants where the waiters seemed born knowing his wine preferences. He said he admired my calm. He said I had substance, which is what rich men often say when they want to praise a woman's intelligence without imagining a future in which it obstructs them. At the time, I did not hear the warning inside the compliment. The first year of our marriage was not unhappy. I want to be fair, even now. Charles could be attentive when attention cost him nothing. He remembered what tea I liked. He sent books to my office with notes tucked inside. On the flight to Florence for our honeymoon, he held my hand through turbulence, though it was I who flew better than he did. I do not believe every unkind person begins as a fraud. I think many begin as versions of themselves they later discover are too inconvenient to maintain. The change was gradual, which made it easy to excuse. When I left my firm, it was meant to be temporary. Charles's mother had just died. The company was in the middle of a restructuring, and he said the travel would be easier if one of us was flexible. I remember standing in our kitchen one Sunday morning while he poured coffee and said, "You've done enough for a while, Margot. You don't have to prove anything anymore." It sounded loving. It was in fact the first brick in the wall. Temporary became indefinite. Indefinite became expected. I joined boards, chaired event committees, hosted donors, managed social obligations, reviewed menus, selected linens, remembered spouses, birthdays, preferences, allergies, old rivalries, and the subtle seating arrangements that prevent powerful people from becoming suddenly impossible. I became useful in ways that made my previous usefulness easy to forget. Charles called me my calm in the storm in public, which sounds romantic until you realize storms are admired and calm is merely required. I still read financial news. I still tracked markets. I still kept notes in the margin of the business pages with a pen he never noticed I carried. But whenever I spoke about the company, about risk or leverage or strategy, his smile shifted by a degree. "Not now, darling. You don't have the full context. That's not really your burden anymore." He did not argue with my ideas. That would have granted them equality. He simply placed them gently outside the room. The first time he humiliated me in public, badly enough that I felt it in my spine, was at an investor dinner in January 2025. It was snowing outside, that thick Manhattan snow that makes every taxi look cinematic and every doorman briefly poetic. Charles had invited 6 people to the penthouse dining room, among them a California hotel developer, a woman from Blackstone, and a hedge fund founder named Warren Fisk, who believed his own laughter improved rooms. The meal had been one of those polished affairs in which everyone talks too confidently about hospitality trends, while barely tasting the food. At one point, Fisk turned to me and said, "So, Margot, Charles tells us you used to be in finance." "Accounting," I said. "Forensic work, mostly." "Jesus," Fisk said, grinning. "I'd hate to have you in a divorce." There was laughter, light, superficial. I smiled. "That depends what you were hiding." That got a better laugh, even from Charles. For one small second, I felt myself step naturally into the conversation. Then the Blackstone woman mentioned a European portfolio under consideration, and without thinking, I said, "If you pursue the acquisition at current rates, you'll need a cleaner debt ladder than most of those legacy properties can support. Their cash flow looks better on paper than it will under renovation pressure." The table went quiet. Not hostile, just alert. Warren Fisk turned toward Charles. "Your wife reads the filings." Before Charles answered, there was a moment, a single, perfect moment in which he could have said yes and left it there. He could have smiled, included me, made room. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folded his napkin, and said, "Margot still thinks in footnotes. I keep her around for taste, not capital structure." The room laughed because rooms like that always laugh when the most powerful person supplies the cue. I laughed too because women learn to do that before they learn almost anything else. But something in me went cold. It wasn't the insult itself. I had endured subtler ones for years. It was the efficiency of it, the ease, the way he reduced a real skill to a charming defect and expected my gratitude for the joke. Later that night, when the staff had cleared the last dessert plate and the city was dark beyond the glass, I asked him in our bedroom, "Did you mean that?" He was loosening his cufflinks. "Mean what?" "That you keep me for taste." He looked mildly annoyed, as if I had misunderstood a weather forecast. "Margot, don't be literal. It was a line." "It was my line you turned into a punchline." He shrugged. "You're tired." "I'm not tired." "No," he said, slipping a watch onto the dresser. "You're sensitive." There it was, the old trick. Reclassify the wound as temperament. I did not argue then either, I wish I had. But the truth is more complicated. At 49, after nearly a decade of being slowly translated into somebody more convenient, I had gotten very good at preserving my dignity by spending it sparingly. The catalyst came 3 weeks later and looked, on paper, even smaller. On February 7th, 2025, at 9:15 p.m., Charles hosted a private supper for the board's strategy committee. Vanessa was there, of course, wearing black silk and the expression of a woman who has never had to hide because she has mistaken being indulged for being invisible. I had arranged the flowers, reviewed the guest list, and spent the afternoon with the chef because the Moroccan sea bass had to be removed after one director mentioned a shellfish sensitivity at a fundraiser 6 months earlier. That was the level on which I knew Charles's world, not from the board minutes, but from the structures that kept the board comfortable enough to make him richer. During dessert, one of the directors asked how the new philanthropic initiative would be positioned alongside the merger. Before Charles answered, I said, "There's a perception issue. If the foundation expands while the company is also closing staff positions at 3 regional properties, it will read better if you announce retraining grants first." Charles didn't even look at me. Vanessa did. Then Charles said, into the space above my shoulder, "My wife believes optics can cure mathematics." A few polite chuckles. Vanessa added, "That's why we keep her around. Human texture." And Charles smiled. He smiled. I did not leave the table. I stayed through coffee. I thanked the staff. I stood in the foyer after the last guest left while Charles and Vanessa discussed departure schedules 10 feet from me as if I were a vase. Then I went into my study and shut the door. That room was the smallest room in the penthouse, and the only one Charles had never bothered to redesign. It still held the old walnut desk I had bought before my marriage, 2 shelves of case books from my accounting days, a brass reading lamp, and the painting my grandmother left me of a gray shoreline under low clouds. The room was not beautiful. It was honest. That made it sacred. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. At first, all I intended to do was look. Nothing more dramatic than that. Just look. Davenport Hospitality Group was in the middle of pursuing a heavily publicized acquisition of a boutique European chain called Aurelian Houses, a deal Charles had been courting for months. Every interview he gave treated it as inevitable. Every analyst note quoted his disciplined appetite. What those same notes mentioned, quietly and more accurately, was leverage. The company had expanded aggressively after the pandemic recovery. Too aggressively. The headline numbers were healthy. The underlying structure was not. I read until 2:10 a.m. By the time I closed the laptop, I was no longer angry in the ordinary domestic way. I was alert. The company was carrying more short-term exposure than Charles ever acknowledged publicly. He had refinanced twice using premium urban properties as collateral, pushed maturities outward, and layered new borrowing under assumptions of uninterrupted luxury travel demand. It was not reckless enough to be scandalous. It was simply fragile enough to become catastrophic if pride outran caution. And Charles's pride had been outrunning caution for years. There was something else, too. In the footnotes to a quarterly filing, buried in related party disclosures, I found irregular reimbursements authorized under executive site review and client development. The amounts were not large enough to interest the SEC, but they were large enough to interest me. Private villa stays in Lake Como, charter expenses to San Barthélemy, renovation consultation fees tied to a property the company did not own. Hidden inside executive discretion, they look like carelessness or concealment. The next morning, I made a phone call I had not expected ever to make again. Naomi Pierce speaking. Even her voicemail sounded exact. Naomi, it's Margot Sinclair. There was a beat of silence, then, well, either you've finally written the novel you were always going to lie about, or something has gone wrong. Naomi had been my managing director at Halpern & Pierce years earlier. She was 68, sharp as winter, and one of the only people I had ever known who could make silence feel like cross-examination. When I left the firm, she had hugged me once, briefly, and said, "Retirement by marriage is an underfunded delusion." At the time, I thought she was bitter. Later, I understood she was simply rarely wrong. "I need discretion," I said. "You've called the correct woman. I also need to know if what I'm seeing is real or if I'm just angry." "That depends," she replied, "which is usually the beginning of better decisions. Lunch." We met that afternoon at a quiet restaurant on East 63rd where nobody under 50 seemed to eat and the waiters treated privacy like a religion. Naomi listened while I explained the filings, the reimbursement patterns, the debt structure, the merger timing. I did not tell her everything about my marriage. I did not need to. Women like Naomi do not require a full confession to identify a mess. When I was done, she folded her hands and said, "You are not imagining it." My body did something strange then. Not relief, recognition. "He's overextended," she said. "Not publicly, not yet, but enough that the wrong pressure point would matter. More interestingly, he's sloppy. That is unusual for men who built themselves on discipline." "Vanessa," I said. Naomi's mouth flattened. "Probably." I looked out the window at a woman walking a dachshund in a camel coat and heard my own voice ask, "If someone wanted leverage, where would they take it from?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She studied me in that unnerving way of hers, as if checking how much of me had already moved ahead of my own words. Finally, she said, "That depends whether someone wants revenge, control, or freedom." I thought for a long time before replying. "Freedom," I said. She gave one small nod. "Good. Revenge is expensive and never diversified." There are inheritances you know about, and inheritances that stay dormant until your life becomes shaped precisely enough to need them. Mine had been left by my grandmother, Louise Sinclair, a public school librarian with modest dresses, blunt opinions, and a genius for private investing that she never advertised because she considered advertising one's intelligence a vulgar waste of intelligence. When she died in 2018, she left me a sealed letter and a holding structure I had barely touched. At the time, I was newly married, still persuading myself that I had chosen stability rather than surrender. I looked at the documents, saw sufficient security, and filed them away. That evening, I went back through the trust papers in my study. By 6:30, I understood what my grandmother had done. Over 2 decades, with small, disciplined investments and a near superstitious hatred of consumer debt, she had built a substantial private portfolio held through a family trust managed by a discreet Philadelphia firm. It was not the kind of money Charles or his friends would consider empire-sized, which made it more powerful than empire money because nobody would think to look for it. It was patient money, quiet money, money accustomed to being ignored. Inside the envelope, addressed in her narrow, slanted handwriting to Margot, when you stop apologizing, there was one page. It said, "For a woman who has finally noticed the room she is in, spend carefully, leave cleanly, never confuse being chosen with being valued." I sat there for a very long time after reading that note. Then I called Naomi back. "I have capital," I said. "How much?" I told her. She was silent for 2 seconds. "Louise Sinclair was a dark horse." "Yes." "Are you ready to stop being ornamental?" "Yes." That was the beginning of my second life. For the next 7 months, I lived in the same penthouse, slept beside the same man, hosted the same donors, attended the same board lunches, and became somebody entirely different without changing my voice above room temperature. Naomi introduced me to Elias Voss, a restructuring attorney with the manners of an undertaker and the ethics of a very old surgeon. He did not ask intrusive questions. He only asked useful ones. What was my objective? What level of exposure could I tolerate? Did I intend to remain married through the transaction? Was public humiliation required or merely likely? I'm not interested in theatrics, I told him during our first meeting in a private conference room overlooking Lower Manhattan. I want control over the part of the structure he's ignoring. That would be the debt, he said. Yes. He almost smiled. Charles was focused on equity, press, perception, and merger optics. He assumed the world would keep financing his confidence because it usually had. What he did not see was the paper beneath him changing hands. 2 private lenders had already begun to worry about covenant pressure if the Aurelian deal closed without fresh operating buffer. A boutique credit fund in Zurich wanted out of a mezzanine position tied to 3 of Davenport's flagship properties. Another fund in Toronto had grown nervous after noticing expense irregularities and executive travel burn. Individually, these were murmurs. Collectively, they were leverage. Through a newly formed private vehicle called Alder Ridge Capital, wholly separate from my name, we started buying the paper nobody glamorous enough wanted to discuss at cocktails. The work was painstaking, technical, almost intimate. We acquired positions quietly through negotiated transfers and secondary market blocks, keeping our footprint deliberately ambiguous. I relearned my old brain. I reread credit agreements at midnight while Charles snored beside me after another late strategy dinner that had left lipstick on a whiskey glass in the kitchen. I memorized covenant triggers. I built timelines. I tracked who on the board still had an independent spine and who merely rented one when headlines required it. The strangest part was how alive I felt. Not because I enjoyed deceit. I didn't. But because for the first time in years, my mind was fully occupied by something that was mine. Every spreadsheet felt like reclaimed territory. Every discreet call, every redline clause, every small acquisition under Alder Ridge restored something Charles had spent years treating as decorative residue. Vanessa, meanwhile, grew less careful. Affairs survive on secrecy only if one side understands risk. Vanessa understood entitlement. That is not the same thing. She approved reimbursements too boldly. She used corporate travel to cloak personal indulgence. She moved through the company like a woman who believed promotion made her invisible to scrutiny. It did not. It merely made her expensive. I never confronted Charles about her, not because I was weak and not because I didn't care, because by then I had learned something useful. Direct confrontation is often a gift to people who still hold the room. They prepare for tears. They know how to deny, minimize, recast, soothe, attack. What they do not prepare for is silence followed by structural damage. In June, there was a dinner at our home for 2 European bankers tied to the Aurelian transaction. Vanessa attended in ivory satin, though no spouse had been invited besides me. At one point, she stood near Charles at the bar, touched his sleeve while laughing at something forgettable, and I watched one of the bankers' wives notice the gesture with the faint satisfaction. Women sometimes take in seeing another woman publicly wronged so long as it is not them. Charles caught me looking. He came over later while dessert was being served and bent near my ear, smiling for the table. "Don't look so solemn," he murmured. "People notice." I turned to him and smiled back just enough. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm looking." He actually blinked. Small victory, quiet. Mine. By August, Alder Ridge held enough of the relevant debt to matter. Not enough to trigger panic, enough to command a seat when panic arrived. The real opening came on September 19th when an internal audit committee member, one of the few directors Charles dismissed because she was both careful and female, requested clarification on certain executive expenses. Naomi had predicted it weeks earlier. "Men like your husband don't fall because someone noble exposes them," she told me over a secure call. "They fall because arrogance produces paperwork." The audit inquiry did not accuse anyone of fraud. It did something more dangerous. It asked questions at the wrong time. The lenders we had been quietly absorbing from noticed. Concern widened. Terms tightened. The board requested additional disclosures. Charles tried to brush it off, assuming prestige would outrun scrutiny. It might have, if he had not insisted on scheduling the annual Davenport Foundation Gala for October 3rd, as both a philanthropic event and unofficial coronation of the Aurelian deal. That was his final mistake. He wanted a public triumph. He wanted photographs of certainty. He wanted the market to see him smiling before the paperwork was complete. So I gave him exactly what he asked for. The week before the gala, he came into my dressing room one evening while I was reading. He leaned against the doorframe, one hand in his pocket. "Wear the emeralds Friday," he said. "The green photographs well against the bellwether lighting." I looked up from my book. "And if I don't?" He smiled without warmth. "Don't be theatrical, Margot." There is a particular kind of intimacy in hearing a man warn you against the quality he has spent years manufacturing in himself. "All right," I said. He left satisfied. In the final 48 hours, everything accelerated. Elias finalized the voting arrangements tied to the lender consortium. Naomi coordinated with the independent directors prepared to move if covenant breach and governance failures could be demonstrated simultaneously. The audit committee received the last batch of documentation regarding misuse of company funds. A standstill letter was prepared, so was a proposed interim governance structure. At 8:15 a.m. on October 3rd, Alder Ridge Capital became, by legal mechanism and lender alignment, the decisive controlling voice in Davenport's restructuring process. At 2 p.m., I received confirmation that the board's emergency written consent package was complete, pending formal delivery if the company attempted to announce the Aurelian transaction before remedial governance conditions were met. At 5:30, I sat before the mirror while my hair was being pinned and thought, absurdly, of my grandmother shelving books in sensible shoes. At 6:10, I sent one message to Naomi. "If I get sentimental, remind me who taught me arithmetic." She replied immediately, "Louise did. Finish the equation." The gown I chose was crimson because Charles hated unnecessary attention on women he believed already accounted for. He liked me in ivory, black, navy, muted metallics, tones that signaled taste without risk. Crimson was not rebellion for its own sake. It was strategic visibility. If I was about to alter the architecture of his world, I wanted him and everyone else to remember what I looked like when I did it. When I came into the bedroom dressed, Charles was fastening his cufflinks. He looked at me once and frowned. "That's not what I suggested." "No," I said. "It isn't." He considered objecting, but he was late enough that vanity beat irritation. "Fine, try not to make an entrance." I almost pitied him then. Almost. He left first, as planned, to greet donors and pose beneath the foundation logo. I arrived 40 minutes later, alone, and did exactly what he asked me not to do. I made an entrance. The room noticed. Of course it did. Women in those circles always notice first, because they have spent their entire lives being measured visually and know precisely when another woman has changed the rules. Then the men turned, then the whispers. Not vulgar whispers, better than that. Curious ones. There is no sound quite like recognition arriving late. I did not go to Charles. Instead, I crossed the room to greet Elise Moran from Banque Privée Genève, a woman Charles believed he had charmed into supporting the Aurelian Bridge package. Elise kissed both my cheeks and said in her soft, French-inflected English, "You look like a woman with information." "That is because I am one," I replied. Robert Chow from Meridian Capital joined us, then Helen Strauss from the Independent Audit Committee, then Daniel Kwan, who chaired one of the lender review subgroups and had only met me once before under a different name. I watched Charles notice from across the room. First confusion, then irritation, then that dangerous narrowing of the eyes he reserved for variables. Good, I thought. Let him feel a little uncertainty before the room does. By 8:42, he was on stage thanking the audience for their belief in long-term stewardship. At 8:46, he moved into the part of the speech where he was meant to tease a transformative transatlantic expansion. At 8:47, phones began to light up. First one table, then another, then the discreet, synchronized motion of important people pretending not to check urgent messages while absolutely checking urgent messages. Charles faltered only slightly, but I saw it. The host, a polished journalist from a financial network, stepped closer to the side of the stage where an event producer was suddenly whispering into his earpiece. Then, in a moment I will probably remember with clarity, even when I'm old enough to forget my own age, Charles said, smiling. And it gives me great pleasure tonight to confirm that Davenport Hospitality is entering the final phase of... The host touched his elbow. Charles stopped. There was a beat of silence. The host looked at the crowd, then down at the device in his hand, then back up again, with the unmistakable expression of a man deciding whether his professional instincts are about to ruin someone else's evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said carefully, "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there appears to be significant breaking news related to Davenport Hospitality Group." A current ran through the room. Charles stared at him. The host continued, "A corporate filing released moments ago states that an emergency lender-led governance action has been initiated following the suspension of the proposed Aurelian transaction. The filing names Alder Ridge Capital as lead representative of the secured debt consortium and announces immediate board action pending confirmation of interim leadership." I watched Charles's face empty itself of color. The host looked down again, then up. "There is also a board statement," he said, voice now very crisp, "that, subject to formal ratification already in process, names Margot Sinclair as interim executive chair for the restructuring period." Nothing moved. No one coughed. No glass touched china. Even the musicians at the back seemed to stop breathing. Then the room erupted, not loudly, but densely. A collective rush of whispers, phones, glances, calculations. Charles turned toward me in full view of everyone. He did not look angry yet. Anger requires footing. He looked lost. The host, to his credit, did not attempt to rescue him. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said into the microphone, "would you care to comment?" I set down my glass and walked to the stage. The distance was not long, but every step seemed to pass through layers of a life I had already left. The wife who apologized, the hostess who absorbed insult, the woman in ivory who knew where every donor preferred to sit but was never once asked where she preferred to stand. When I reached the stage, Charles moved aside without realizing he had done it. I took the microphone. The chandeliers were hot above me. The room below looked suddenly human, curious, uneasy, hungry. "My name," I said, and my voice sounded exactly like mine, "is Margot Sinclair." That was the first shock. Not Mrs. Davenport, not even Margot Davenport, Margot Sinclair. "I know there are many questions in this room," I continued. "Some of them are financial, some are personal. Fortunately, only the first category concerns me. Tonight." A ripple ran through the audience, small, sharp. Over the last several months, a number of lenders and independent parties grew concerned about the governance, leverage exposure, and strategic direction of Davenport Hospitality Group. Through Alder Ridge Capital, I worked with those parties to prevent an acquisition that would have increased instability rather than created value. The company will continue. The employees will continue to be paid. The properties will continue to operate. But the era of confusing confidence with stewardship is over. I turned then, not dramatically, just enough, to look at Charles. He was still on stage, frozen in the full beam of public recognition. "This was not done to punish ambition," I said. "It was done because ambition without discipline is expensive, and arrogance is never an asset for long." No one in that room would forget that sentence. I knew it as I said it. I handed the microphone back to the host and stepped away before anyone could ask a second question. That was the part people later got wrong in the papers. They wanted me to have delivered a speech of vengeance, to have unmasked an affair, to have publicly humiliated him in the same cheap currency he had spent on me for years. But I did not want cheapness. I wanted accuracy. Humiliation arrived anyway, publicly, cleanly, by his own structures collapsing under the weight of what he had refused to see. The ride home was silent. He sat opposite me in the town car, not beside me. Perhaps habit had finally become symbolism. The city slid by outside in streaks of light. I removed one earring, then the other. I was not trembling. That surprised me. After 9 years of preparing my face for his moods, I had thought my body might not know what to do once I stopped accommodating them. When we reached the penthouse, Charles did not wait for the valet or staff. He unlocked the private elevator himself and stood with both hands clasped behind his back. the way he did when containing anger in front of employees. The moment we were inside the apartment, he turned. "What have you done?" His voice was not loud. Men like Charles often believe volume is for those who have already lost control. I set my clutch on the console table. I think that was made fairly clear. "No," he said, stepping closer. "No, you don't get to do that. Not tonight. Not after ambushing me in front of my board, my investors, Your room," I said. "Your stage. Your evening. Yes, I know. I heard the speech." His jaw tightened. "You went behind my back." I looked at him then, and for the first time in years, saw not a titan, not a husband, not even an adversary. Just a man standing in a room he thought he designed, discovering he had never understood load-bearing walls. "You had my back turned toward you for years," I said. "That's not the same thing." He stared at me as if trying to identify the mechanism that had changed. "Where did the money come from?" I almost laughed. That was his first instinct. Not why, not how long, not what he had missed about me, just capital. "My grandmother," I said. He frowned. "Your grandmother was a school librarian." "Yes," I replied, "and better at long-term strategy than you." He walked to the bar but did not pour a drink. His hands were too unsteady. "This is revenge." "No." "It is." "No," I said again, quieter. "Revenge would have been telling the room about Vanessa." That landed. He looked at me sharply. "So you do know." "I know enough." He said nothing. I continued. "This is not revenge, Charles. Revenge is emotional, costly, imprecise. This is governance." He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You sound rehearsed." "I sound prepared. That's different." He finally poured the whiskey. His fingers knocked the crystal against the bottle neck. "You could have spoken to me." "About what?" "Your leverage, your mistress, your habit of treating me like an upholstered chair." His face changed at that. Not because I had wounded him, because I had named him. "I never—" "Don't," I said. The single word stopped him more effectively than any scream could have. For a few seconds, only the city spoke through the glass. Then he said, "What do you want?" That was the real question, the first real one he had asked me in years. I had thought about that often. "Control of the restructuring process," I said. "Independent review of executive expenditures, preservation of the operating teams at the 3 regional properties you plan to cut, suspension of the Aurelian deal, full cooperation from council, and a clean divorce." He stared at me. "That's it?" I almost smiled. Men who have always been obeyed sometimes hear reason as modesty. "No," I said. "That's the beginning." What followed over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic. Real power rarely is. It is meetings, documents, signatures, timing, professionals who bill by the hour and save you by the claws, not the sword. Vanessa resigned before the audit committee could formally recommend her termination. Her statement cited the need to pursue opportunities aligned with my long-term vision. I admired the sentence. It was cowardly but grammatical. The board ratified my interim role unanimously, except for one abstention from a man who wore loyalty like a very old tie. The lenders approved the revised framework. We preserved 812 jobs across the operating portfolio. The 3 regional properties Charles had intended to cut were refinanced, renovated more modestly, and returned to profitability within the year. The Aurelian deal collapsed publicly and then disappeared, as overhyped transactions often do when the cameras leave. The divorce was finalized in February 2026. Charles did apologize once, properly, though too late to be useful. It happened in January in a conference room at our lawyer's offices after a 6-hour negotiation over property disposition and governance restrictions. By then he looked thinner, less polished, not broken exactly, more honest-faced. Defeat does that to some men. It does not make them better, but it sometimes removes the varnish. When the others stepped out for a moment, he said, without drama, "I did not see you clearly." I sat across from him, pen in hand. "No," I said. You saw me very clearly. You just saw something smaller than what was there." He absorbed that. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that's true." It was the closest we came to peace. People asked for months afterward whether I had planned all of it from the beginning of the marriage. They wanted a clean mythology, a clever wife, a secret fortune, a grand reveal. It disappoints people when the truth is more gradual and more human. I did not marry Charles to defeat him. I married him because he was intelligent, attentive, and for a time, kind enough. Then I stayed because leaving is harder than outsiders imagine, especially when no bruise can be photographed and every insult arrives wrapped in elegance. What changed was not my cruelty. It was my willingness to believe myself. That is a quieter story, but truer. By summer 2026, I was no longer interim anything. I stepped down from day-to-day control at Davenport after the restructuring stabilized, and the board appointed an operator I trusted. Alder Ridge retained a strategic stake. I kept the seat, not the throne. Power had interested me less once I no longer needed it for survival. Instead, I bought a small historic inn in Newport, Rhode Island, a place with 12 rooms, weathered blue shutters, and a breakfast porch that looked toward the water if you leaned far enough. It had once belonged to a widow named Agnes Bell, who ran it for 30 years and paid every staff member through 3 recessions without missing a week. That was the kind of legacy I understood now. I named it the Quiet Ledger. People asked if the name was a joke. It wasn't. The first morning I opened as owner, I stood in the pantry at 6:12 a.m. with coffee in my hand while the pastry chef cursed softly over scone dough and the front desk clerk searched for a reservation he had misfiled. Outside, gulls were screaming and somebody was dragging a suitcase over brick. It was imperfect, ordinary, alive. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence around me did not feel like neglect. It felt like room. Sometimes the papers still mention me. Usually when another executive overextends himself and someone on television says, "Nobody wants another Davenport situation." I have learned to live with being turned into shorthand. It is better than being turned into décor. As for Charles, I hear things, enough to know he survived. Men like him usually do. He sits on fewer panels now, smiles less, speaks more carefully when women in finance are in the room. I do not confuse any of that with redemption, but I suppose education takes the forms it can get. Vanessa remarried a venture capitalist in Austin. The last photograph I saw of her was taken at an outdoor wedding under string lights, her face arranged into the same bright confidence she wore in my ballroom. I felt nothing when I saw it. That, more than anything, told me I was free. Naomi still calls every few weeks, usually to tell me something mercilessly accurate about a headline I haven't yet read. Last month, she visited the inn and sat on the porch with a gin martini at 4 in the afternoon, looking at the water as if she had personally negotiated its tide. "You know," she said, "most people think power is the room where they're being watched." I handed her the bowl of almonds. "What is it then?" She took one, considered it, and said, "It's the room where you finally stop asking permission to be fully yourself." That stayed with me. So tonight, after the last guest has gone upstairs and the front desk lamp is the only light left in the lobby, I will probably do what I do most nights. I will straighten the leather-bound register, though it won't need straightening. I will check tomorrow's arrivals. I will stand for a moment in the doorway and listen to the building settle around me. Old places have their own breathing. You can hear it if you are no longer living above your own. And I will think about that October night in New York, the chandeliers, the phones lighting up across the tables, the soundless way a room can turn when truth walks in, dressed in crimson. If you had spent years being treated like a graceful afterthought, would you have blown up the room at the first insult? Or would you have waited until the paperwork, the witnesses, and the timing were all yours? That is what I would want to know about you.